thank you so much for coming today, on this beautiful autumn day. I also wanted to thank Julia Mayer and the Chicago Humanities Festival staff for this opportunity to share part of my research with you. And there's one thing I wanted to let you know, that most of the material that you'll see me performing, I learned from videotapes of the research that we did for the bird brain osprey migration. And as I was learning off the video, I had to figure out how I was going to orient myself in space because the camera person was constantly moving. And I ended up deciding to orient myself in relationship to the ocean, and you're the ocean. Thank you. Enjoy the show.
Hey, good day, everybody. Thank you, Jennifer. Jennifer's going to take a few minutes to, decompress and get changed, and then we'll bring her out here and we'll have a conversation. I'm Zachary Whittenburg. Thank you for being here today. Let me echo what Liz and Jennifer both said earlier. We really appreciate you being here and being part of the Humanities Festival this year. For how many of you in the audience today is this your first festival event so far? All right. Well, there's a ton of great stuff going on through November the 10th, and make sure you make time to catch at least another couple of things before the festival runs its course. It's a huge honor and pleasure to be able to pick Jennifer's brain here today, because I just think that she's an artist of incredible sensitivity and sort of a bottomless inquisitiveness. We talk a lot about art, and especially the performing arts, as being a method of making connections and connecting to one another. But I think one of the things that's really extraordinary about the work that Jennifer is doing now and has been working on through multiple projects over the last few years is just how well and how completely she's able to make connections between a huge range of ideas and fields of study, emotional terrain, intellectual terrain, all of these things, and making and building the connections between these things that we would sort of generally think of as being incredibly disparate through dance investigation, through movement, and just this way in which dance is revealed as this very pliable sort of bond in many ways, and allows for the creation of a space in which you can investigate a bunch of different things sort of in parallel and simultaneously. So the work that we're going to generally be focusing on today in our conversation is Live Dancing Archive, and it has sort of three central components. There's a video, which I don't know if any of you were able to see. The Humanities Festival graciously screened two different screenings of a video that runs about 3 hours in length. It's culled from about 50 total hours of footage, taken mostly while Jennifer and three dancers were tracing the migratory pattern south from Maine to Venezuela of osprey. And so there's a lot of video documentation part of that journey, and then was edited and distilled into this video component of Live Dancing Archive. There's an online component, which we'll also look at today a little bit and poke around, and which I encourage you all to, after today's event is over, dial it up in your web browser and poke around a little bit and just look at some of the wealth of documentation and material that's online as part of that component of Live Dancing Archive. And then the third element of the project is the live performance, part of which you just saw. The entire thing runs about an hour in length. And it premiered in February of this year at the Kitchen, which is a very celebrated, very beloved dance venue in Manhattan. So if we can work backwards through those things, and I think we're all set up here, so we can also just sit down, give you a chance to rest. I'd like to talk a little bit about what we just saw, this performance. Sort of what does that represent and what doesn't it represent of the entire evening that you presented in New York?
So you saw the first portion of the performance. I'm going to be super literal about my description of it. I just also really need to mention that it is a collaboration with a lighting designer and a sound artist, composer. The lighting designer has worked with me in the past and was very aware of that much of natural light is reflected. So we had a long white screen that was maybe 18 inches wide and 12 feet long, something like that, that was on wheels, that was moved around through the space to create different locations for the dance sequences to happen in. And then there were three lights, they're like photography lights, that the lighting designer moved on stage as well. So there's a real intimate sense of creating different spaces for each one of these phrases. And then the sound was made by a Chicago-based artist, Jeff Kolar, who I can't say praise enough. I think he's just a genius. And he was very aware of the environmental nature of this piece and made his own transmitters and receivers, radio transmitters and receivers. So he's literally making, or the way I understand it, making audible the acoustic environment of the space that we're in. And it's very adaptive to how many people are in the room, how many people's cell phones are on, if there's a rainstorm, that kind of thing. So it's literally a live experience also, and it really changes my experience of the dancing. The first phrase that you saw was from someplace on Cape Cod. It's called the grass phrase. The second one, the next three phrases come from a research period that we had at Ocracoke Island in North Carolina. And during the osprey migration, we'd take several days, not several, but 2 or 3 days just for research to kind of recoup versus just performing and providing workshops. And it was a series of, the score was, we'd done a long warm-up during the day, and then the score was one person danced a 3-minute map based on the experience of the day, and then the next person used that, a 3-minute dance, the next person used that as a map, and then the next person used those 2 dances as a map, and the third. So there's this kind of accumulation of danced and physical territories that are in the bodies. One of the reasons I chose to do that is so that I could be in the bodies of the other dancers that were part of this research, and somehow it made more sense than trying to document really different landscapes. It just seemed too vast to take 8 weeks from Maine through Cuba to Venezuela. So there was a kind of really focused research on just one place, just proposing that dance might be a reliable, unreliable way of documenting ecosystems and those relationships.
Mm-hmm. Well, and one of the things that is really kind of a hot topic and a lot of people are really thinking about in the field today is this idea of archive and documentation. And what we've seen is, in the last 15 or so years, there have been the development and refinement and introduction of multiple technologies that provide ways of documenting dance performance, dance practice, process, in ways that were never before available. So, for instance, there's, as we all probably have in our pockets, a really easy to use, versatile tool for capturing video and still images, in very high resolution. There's all sorts of technologies around motion capture in 3-dimensional space that are now applied today, from everything from visual effects for filmmakers to the sort of the peripheral hardware that people use with video game machines, and to allowing them to do gesture-based controls in 3 dimensions to interact with software in a gaming application. But it's also, a lot of that is really directly transferable to dance. So there's all of these ways, in all of your correspondence probably, most of your correspondence is automatically archived. I am constantly searching my Gmail account for things that I can't remember all the time. And it's easy to forget that not too long ago, the process of archiving correspondence could be very time consuming and something that you would have to do sort of on purpose and devote a lot of resource and time to. Now, adjacent to all of this stuff is this question that I think your work proposes and in some ways seeks to answer about what sorts of ways and things are documentable and archivable by the dancing body, and in what ways is dance a vehicle or can it be a tool for storing, remembering, re-experiencing, transferring knowledge gained. And I think that a lot of the writing that you've done and a lot of the conversation that has already occurred around Live Dancing Archive and your current work, has that as a point of focus for sure. And so I was just curious if you could talk a little bit more about, just in a very general sense, this idea of the dancing body as archive. What does that mean? And how do you access it for yourself? And in what ways is the information sort of stored in there, if you will, accessible to others?
How many dancers are here in the room? Video choreographers? So we all know, right, that when we look at a video, it's a very pale comparison of both our experience of being in the work and being outside of it and seeing work. So I think many choreographers are resistant to the idea of documenting through these fantastic technological tools, and I'm certainly one of those. And doing this research, I realized that what archives do, they do many things, but what I was finding that I was most compelled by is they make visible what's absent. So what you become aware of isn't there. And I think, a lot of this work comes from my own history of being part of living and growing up in habitats and ecosystems that are changing very rapidly, and there's a kind of grief that goes along with seeing the towns that we grew up in become suburban malls and box stores. And that's something that's not really, I'm sure people archive grief all the time, but it's a hard thing to do, right? So you have to create a certain kind of space for that. And the thing I learned from putting my body in these environments as a way of understanding them was that there's kind of multiple scales. And this is the thing I have the hardest time articulating. And if any of you have help, I would love that. But I feel like dance is such a rich medium for looking at different scales, from the infinite to the very microscopic, both spatially and temporally, because it's moving through time, because as a viewer you have to hold what happened, what's going to happen, your anticipation of what's happening, which is very much how I experience an ecosystem. You're looking at a forest and you see the leaf right close to you, and then you see the wind blowing the leaves, and then you see the birds moving through. There's a kind of multiplicity that I find dance very eloquent in articulating. I don't know if I'm really answering your question, but I felt, after I've been doing this work since 2000, that my own dancing had a particular kind of information in it that I didn't see in other bodies. And I felt like I was really curious about really diving in and researching what that was. And at the same time, I also felt that this Bird Brain project was incredibly expansive. It did all kinds of things. And like the making the digital archive, I was really hoping it could be, the great thing about an archive too is when you make it, you have no idea what anyone is going to use it for. And they're often reread and re-understood, and they reinterpret our understanding of history and of the future and all these things. So I was imagining that, an educational, environmental educator could use this and develop kinesthetic ways of teaching about the environment, or actual environmental scientists could say, look at how these landscapes have changed in 10 years. So part of my desire was to put it out there so that it could be repurposed.
I'm wearing my microphone, so you can hold it. Well, so one of the words that kind of came to mind when I was watching the video component of the project was recording. There's a sense that I got from, especially the stretches of the film where we're really watching you and these three dancers in a specific site, and dancing both in the way that they are sort of compelled to move by that specific site, and also just on a purely logistical level, just how they can and how they can't. You're on pavements, you're on sand. There's a stretch where you're on a rocky beach and doing a lot of dancing low to the ground, sitting, sort of what would in a dance studio context be floor work, but you're on this sort of rocky beach and negotiating. And on the one hand, there's this sense of transfer, that this is, dance material, dance vocabulary transferred to a non-traditional context. But there's also this reverse feed that I get and that I sense, that the movement through the landscape using your body is in some ways a recording of that landscape, recording of the aspects of not just the space as it would be over a week's time, but in that present moment, in that specific moment. There's a lot of, in the footage, there's a lot of focus on wind, and you spend a lot of time just watching the wind work on these 4 dancing bodies and working on the material that you're wearing and affecting the movements that you're doing in a way that, we don't sort of find ourselves negotiating gusts of wind when we're dancing in a studio, right? And so a lot of this other stuff starts to open up. And, I was just curious about how does that word recording land with you? Does it seem accurate? Is there an aspect that it's something that you're recording with your body using movement to sort of lock in, partially so that you can access it again later?
Yeah, it's funny, recording isn't necessarily a word that pops to my mind, maybe, but I do feel like, I think I use the word absorbing, that I feel like dancing outside, one is absorbing these various scales and negotiations. And I think, my own understanding of choreography has really expanded from all the dances, all the performances happened outside and all the research happened outside, but they moved through space. So there was a kind of limitless possibility. It's very different than working in the contained space of a stage. And I do think, as you were speaking, I was thinking about performing here, and my body is completely different. It's 12 years older, and I'm not dancing in the sand, and I'm doing other people's work who had different capacities than my body has. So in there, I think there's also that sense of what's missing, but then there's also something about what becomes present then. There is this recreation that also seems like the very dynamic understanding of how ecosystems are always changing too. They're not like gone, they're just changed.
Yeah.
So there's some way that it implies a kind of hopefulness to me. Actually, this work makes me quite hopeful about these really radical changes we may face with climate change.
Yeah. Well, and it also, it's in some ways, I don't know, an answer or a corrective maybe to this sort of lineage of a lot of dance study and dance making and dance exploration, throughout the 20th century and since we entered the 21st, that it sort of increasingly became something that took place in very controlled environments. You look at the trajectory of postmodern dance and, the sort of explosion of creativity and theory that came out of the Judson Church, late 50s, early 1960s, and all of the branches that sort of come from that. More, it's sort of hyper-controlled, almost a laboratory kind of an environment where, all aspects of the sound are under the artist's control, all aspects of the, stage environment and the costumes and the temperature. And so dance becomes was able to become this very theoretical architecture that contained a lot of very intellectual ideas. And there's something about placing the body back in natural environments that I think is really important in your work and that is valuable for what it reactivates in the body, that is lost when the body is not subject to anything that it's not sort of actively bringing upon itself. So and I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that as someone who's been on both sides of that equation, right? You've made studio work for the stage, and you've also logged countless hours, thousands probably of hours, doing dancing outside and in very, very different environments. There's parts in this video that we'll see that you were in the rain and it's not always warm, and there's a great scene where you're all kind of like going into the water and going swimming, and there's an exclamation of like how cold the water is and stuff like that. All of these things that dancers wouldn't traditionally be subject to. So how do those two things play off of each other in your practice and in your process? And also, how is that maybe echoed by this exploration and this sort of parallel interest you have in natural environments and the built environment and urban spaces?
There's something about the outdoor work that's very much about a particular kind of research that, again, is about these indeterminate systems and sense of scale and a sense of porousness, and your sense of time really changes, and that you have to take time to get there, and you have to take time to adjust to the temperature and the conditions of the site, and there's so much to pay attention to, there's so much coming in, you're processing so much information. And then it's kind of like doing field research and then going to the laboratory and looking at the microscope and breaking things apart and experimenting, like making your little control zones with the theater. It's much more, it's a different kind of research. And there's also, it's interesting because it brings up these questions about how one engages audience, even though in the bird brain migration we set up conditions for sharing the work in performances. But looking back at the video, I realized the performances were really not as interesting as the research. So setting up the conditions and the kind of aesthetic values in the theater teaches me a lot as well.
Well, so here we're on the online component of the project, which you can see here, livedancingarchive.org. Check it out. There's a ton of stuff here. And you can browse by all sorts of different object types. But one of the things that we wanted to show a little bit of today is some footage. And so before I hit play here, you can just sort of tell us quickly what we're going to be looking at in this particular clip.
So these are the actual clips that I learned the material from, and this is at Ocracoke, and it's Jennifer's phrase, and Javier's phrase, and Alejandra's phrase, and Morgan's phrase. I went first. I think I've actually reorganized them in the performance, but we don't have all of mine, but there's mine, and then Javier's, and then Alejandra, and then Morgan.
Okay, great.
Looks like it might. This is Ocracoke Island. It's the Outer Banks of North Carolina. It's very beautiful. We were there, I think, for like 2.5 days or something, and I had a lot of epiphanies about the project here, and there was a lot of writing about it. We tried to keep track of our experiences through journal writing, and we had someone actually give us a writing workshop in Cape Cod. I was really interested in documenting this, and when the gray whale migration was the first one, and that was in the spring of 2001.
And that was on the west.
Yeah, it was on the West Coast, but at that point, websites were a relatively new phenomenon, and designing one and figuring out to you could make little tiny thumbnails of like 30 seconds to upload, because we were still uploading on phone lines, often at some national park in the midst of the redwoods or something.
And then you did a third migration project, Ducks and Geese.
Yeah, which we came through. We worked with Peter Taub at the MCA and the
Right.
Note Art Museum, which is right there. The one that Liz was referencing, we had buses we really left the MCA very early in the morning and got these fantastic tours of the Calumet area and performed there.
Are there additional migrations?
There's a fourth migration that I really would love to do that follows northern wheat ears, that would go from the Arctic through northern Europe along the Iberian Peninsula to West Africa.
How do you dance in the Arctic?
I don't know. That's the problem. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
And also now that, even traveling that far and the amount of fuel it would take, all those kind of questions come up once one begins to really consider these sustainability issues. And so that, I think, has made me look more closely at the urban environment. So the projects I did after that, it's the same one. But I think it's just taking time to look. Oh, we were going to, okay.
And then going back to the osprey migration, so you began in Maine. You ended in Venezuela, and that's where the osprey go in the winter. And then you wanted to show a little bit about, this is toward the end of that journey, and
Yeah.
8 weeks in.
So we're in the Henri Petier National Park there, and working with, I don't know, are any of you involved in the Audubon Society? It's just an amazing organization, right? And every local club is kind of runs their own world, but they're all kind of connected to each other. So anyway, this was a local club out of Valencia, and they were doing mist netting, where you put these thin nets up at dawn, and then you catch the birds as they're coming down. Most songbirds migrate at night, and then they come down to rest at dawn. And it was amazing to be there catching these beautiful migrating warblers and things, but we actually did get a water thrush from Maine, so it had traveled the same distance that we had, so that was super exciting. But the one thing that, you learn about birds is their ability to adapt to these really different ecosystems and the delicate ways that they help the ecosystems that they move through function.
Well, there was something really interesting ahead of the opening of the February performance at the Kitchen. There's a really terrific article that you can find online that Brian Siebert wrote for the New York Times that provides a lot of context and background, and he interviewed you about this project. And not to spoil the ending for you, but I really, really love this idea that comes at the end of the story. He says, in her travels and studies, Ms. Monson also learned about broad-winged hawks, which cover large distances with minimum energy by following mountain ridges to ride thermal currents. That's a metaphor for me, you said. The most efficient way to get where you want to go is not necessarily the most direct, and there's something about that in my dancing. So, if you could talk a little bit, because I know before today we were chatting a little bit, and one of the things you said that you weren't interested in is sort of analogizing or, talking about like, oh, this movement looks like this kind of an animal, or like in what ways are you sort of literally embodying animal movement? And that wasn't really sort of the thrust of the project, and that's not where you were going with it. But there is this sort of learning, this sort of physical learning, movement learning of animal strategies and things, and I find that really fascinating. And aside from this hawk example, what are maybe some of the other things that you sort of were able to adopt and discover by following these species?
Well, certainly the navigational strategies that animals use and learning about those deeply influenced my practice. And we would start each one of our performances with a workshop where I asked people to close their eyes, I give them some kind of kinesthetic guidelines, and then with their eyes closed to turn and face north. And that always generates a really interesting conversation because everyone navigates slightly differently or extremely differently. And people in cities navigate differently than people in the country, or people on the coast navigate differently than people who live by mountains. So that, and then one could talk about the way that birds are able, or most birds have magnetite in their beaks, and so they can actually follow electromagnetic fields. But then also they're able to hear infrasound, so we'd also do a listening exercise. And that idea that a migrating bird might navigate by listening to the Atlantic waves crashing, the wind blowing through the Rocky Mountains, and volcanic rumblings in Costa Rica was completely fascinating to me. And I was eager to see if I could strengthen my own perceptual awareness of the world to be more like that of animals. So there are ways that those strategies have really tuned me to what's going on around me in both the built and the natural environment that I think definitely influence my dancing. And I really think about dance as a system and choreography as a choreographic system, so that it can be interpretive dancing, and I'm sure that comes into my dancing in some way, but it also can be that relationship to space and the proximity to the center and the distal edges, or it begins to negotiate all these things that choreography does very specifically. And so I think that's why I'm drawn to improvisation, because it puts in motion a set of relationships and ways of making decisions, or that's idea of system is important to me.
Yeah, and it brings up something that we were talking about earlier too, about what the idea of wild, what that word sort of meant to you at the start of this project, and how it developed, and how it took on sort of a different kind of meaning, and your relationship to the idea of wildness and nature evolved through the course of this project. And I think that the larger sort of implication of that in the work for me is that, you know, our recent history has really been one about sort of knowing and understanding and finding sort of hard data and proof, and, you know, certainly like the thrust of scientific history is about knowing and learning and understanding. And that, you know, dance provides and can provide a very valuable, you know, retention of this connection to the wild, to the mystery, because even for, you know, a 40, 50-year dancer going into the studio every day, there's something essentially mysterious, and there's always this possibility of surprise. The dancing experience, for me personally, often sort of brings up a whole bunch of stuff, you know, and you'll do something and sort of be caught off guard by what the dance and the dancing experience has revealed to me, especially if I'm not trying too hard to make something specific happen. It's in these moments of sort of, after you're sort of warmed up and in the zone, you might say, the dance kind of can reveal, the act of dancing can reveal things to you that are coming from you. No one else is sort of feeding them to you, but they can be unexpected, or they can prompt connections that you sort of didn't realize might be there. Does that resonate with you? Is there something in that to what you're doing? And
Yeah, absolutely. I'm wondering if maybe we should open it up to
we
questions
definitely
from
wanna leave some time
the audience. Anybody have any questions?
Hopefully I can articulate it, because I'm not, I don't watch dance a lot, okay? So listening to what you were saying, because I was thinking recently how, I'm from New York State.
Can you
So-
speak, hold up?
I'm very sorry.
Thank you.
I'm from New York State. So I just had the idea the other day how the light is different. Everywhere you go, the light is different. You know, how the sun shines at different seasons of the year. So relating that to something you were talking about earlier, when you're talking about memory, incorporating memory in your physical being, when places change and you go back to them and something's not there anymore. So to be able to express that memory in a universal way, that I think that's why you're doing the archiving, because it would be very difficult, right, to tell the story, especially in a travel, of a migration, because the light will be different. The light will be different in Venezuela. The ocean may act a little differently at different shores. But you're also documenting something that we are aware will change. So you're preserving it that way, and then expressing it also through your physical reaction in dance. Am I following that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm
It's
having a
just
little
fascinating to me.
hard time hearing you. I'm slightly
Oh, I'm
deaf,
sorry.
so-
I'm sorry. I have a hard time talking real loud. I talk a lot, but loud is a little tougher. It just fascinates me because I think about those issues a lot, like that a lot of our memories are stored in our senses. So you could smell something or see a certain light, and it will evoke memory. For a lot of us, it might be a childhood thing or whatever, you know, good memories or different. But what you're doing is documenting changes in environment. And that's fascinating. Well, thank you.
I'd be super curious to ask you a question if you don't have to answer it, but
Okay.
if watching me dancing, I know if you see spaces or if you see just my body, if you see something
No,
beyond
I was
just my
trying
body.
to. I have a hard time, you know, that's
Yeah.
not, you know, I just have my own time-space sense, you know, we all do. And that's what I was trying to get from it. But I was also trying to get the story, so I was curious as to why there was no music or the sounds. That's
Right.
just me, you know,
Right.
to try to integrate what you were doing with what you were expressing, you know. I mean, some of it I could get, some of it I could not, but that's me. But
No,
once
thank
I'm
you.
seeing this, I'm really appreciating it.
Yeah.
Much more.
Oh,
Seeing
okay, yeah.
like
great.
that, so I like what you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Always ready to jump in. I learned so much. I thought I knew. I thought I knew. You can just. I thought I knew a lot about your work, but I learned so much here. So thank you very much. And I'd like to ask. I have two questions, but I think I'll go. Oh. That there's a paradox that in the dance, as we conventionally think of it, as this rule-bound vocabulary of steps and port de bras and so on. And here, your idea of creating a system in improvisation and the decisions in that system, does every new project have its own system and its own set of rules, would be my question.
Yeah, you're making me think about these conversations that I had with Zach about, so how another part of this project, when he initially asked me what's absent from what you saw today, there's these two other sections of Live Dancing Archive, one in which I put on a wig and lipstick and I sing to Anthony and Johnson's Bird Girl. So, and then the other, there's three. Another one, I put on a dress and I dance, my version of an early expressive modern dance that, it's called the Mary Vigmon section. And then another, I'm naked and I'm sweeping these coffee cup lids along the floor. And those, I think, come out of my training as a dancer and where I grew up and how I was educated, and they're in resistance to, I never had a balletic body. I was never going to be a ballet dancer. Many of us have this story. So we all negotiate our ways how we're going to make a dancing body that's our own, that we own, that resists like a certain gender identification or, so much of power gets manifested and processed through bodies. So I learned to really resist that through dance. Dance was, when I was like in the 90s and very involved in ACT UP and AIDS activism and queer activism, I was like going to be as strong as any man and like really reckless and violent in my dancing because there was so much going on and bodies were empowered to make change on the street in a really different way than they are now. So that is part of my history that I think begins to come through. And then the Mary Vigmon too, I do really relate to what is that, how do you make a dance with that famous Doris Humphrey or Martha Graham, like you stand in the studio and the light, the muse pours through your body. I think some of us, there's some aspect of, even when you're talking about what's wild, where something unknown and mysterious and uncontrollable and uncontainable moves through us, all of us. And artists, I get the opportunity to work that out and ask rigorous questions about that. Mm-hmm. So I would say that each piece, I've been in this theme of critiquing, along with all the visual artists who are critiquing landscape painting for, how do we represent these environments? What environments are allowed to be pure and beautiful? And I think that relates to my own understanding of being a queer person and using queer theory as a way of knowing the world. Like there's these kind of marginalized spaces are places where ecosystems thrive and cultures thrive. And I think I have a kind of need some friction or resistance in my world. So kind of look for that. Not so much anymore, but maybe, I don't know.
Do we have any other questions? Okay, great.
Hi, I hope this is working. I was aware of the space in the light, and it was particularly apparent when you were dancing towards this side of the space, and there was a wonderful shadow on the wall. We traveled years ago to Indiana to the migration of the cranes. We walked up to the fence, and we're looking all over the place for the cranes, and there seemed to be a huge lake out in the middle of the field. Eventually, we realized that was the cranes, 10,000 of them. And the movement within that lake, as well as the movement of the birds landing and taking off, was just absolutely incredible on a visual, sensual, and emotional level. And in fact, when they landed in the middle, there were times when there was absolutely no movement from the group. They just, huge birds coming down very lightly and finding a space in between. And some of your movement up there evokes that kind of space and both grounding and upper movement. So thank you.
Thank you very much. It's one of the best compliments I've ever had. Though those, I mean, have other people seen these massive migrations? They're so moving. Like, though, I think that's the kind of, how do you negotiate that? How do you, that sense of wonder that we get from a world we're so removed from, and how do you bring that wonder back into, like, oh my God, there's electricity running through that cable, and it's generating these little squares that are creating an image of light and movement that are allowing us to see this other space. You know? It's like bringing that kind of wonder to everything.
Yeah. There was one more? Is that still true? Well, I'll encourage you all again to visit livedancingarchive.org. Jennifer and I will be here for another few minutes if you want to track us down and talk to us face to face. And again, please make some time for some of the rest of this wonderful programming that Chicago Humanities Festival has put together, looking at animals and humans. I've been Zachary Whittenburg. This is Jennifer Monson. Thank you to Dana Calderon and to T. Paul Lowry and to Julia Mayer and to everyone here at the festival for having us, and enjoy the rest of your Sunday.